Am I to blame for blocking my father when he slept through my wedding? My name is Emily. I'm 32. And just last week, I married the love of my life, a wonderful man named Daniel. It was a civil ceremony, simple yet meaningful, reflecting our love rather than grandeur. But what should have been a cherished moment of joy has left me grappling with a question I can't shake. Was I wrong to block my father after he didn't bother to attend my wedding? Let me backtrack a little. Daniel and I currently live in Europe, while my family, my parents and sister, live in Southeast Asia. With limited finances, Daniel and I planned a small wedding, attended only by a handful of close friends and some of his family members. While I had hoped to have my family physically present, it just wasn't feasible. So, we came up with an alternative, a video call. It wasn't perfect, but it would allow my parents and sister to be part of the ceremony in their own way, despite the distance. The wedding was scheduled at 9 p.m. their time, and I made sure to inform them well in advance. On the day itself, I called my sister, who joined the video call with my mother. I was so caught up in the whirlwind of emotions and logistics that I barely noticed my father's absence. When I finally realized he wasn't there, my sister just gave me a sad smile and explained that he had fallen asleep. At the time, I brushed it off, trying not to let anything dampen the happiest day of my life. But as the days passed and my father's actions, or inactions, sank in, I began to feel hurt and confused. And now, I find myself here, laying it all out for you. Am I overreacting? Am I the one at fault here? I grew up in a close-knit but complicated family dynamic. My parents, both loving in their own ways, have always had their quirks. And my sister, younger by 4 years, has been my lifelong companion through thick and thin. Despite the physical distance now separating us, I've always tried to maintain a strong connection with them, cherishing the bond we share. My father, however, is a different story. While there are moments of warmth and care, they are often overshadowed by his emotionally manipulative tendencies. He has always had a way of turning situations to focus on himself, frequently resorting to guilt-tripping to get what he wants. Growing up, this pattern was painfully evident, but it was something we learned to navigate as a family. My mother, a more passive presence, often played the role of mediator, while my sister and I tried our best to maintain some balance. Despite these challenges, I've always believed in the importance of family and worked hard to include them in my life. When I moved to Europe, I made it a priority to stay in touch, updating them on my life and trying to bridge the distance as best as I could. Holidays, birthdays, and milestones always came with video calls, heartfelt messages, and sometimes even small gifts when finances allowed. When it came to my wedding, this same effort extended naturally. I wanted them to feel like a part of the ceremony, even from halfway across the world. It wasn't just about the logistics, it was about the emotional connection. I'd envisioned them watching as Daniel and I exchanged our vows, feeling as though they were right there with us, sharing in our joy. But as I recount the events leading up to that day, I realize how fragile this connection feels at times. My father's actions, or lack thereof, brought old wounds to the surface, making me question not just his priorities, but also the balance of our entire relationship. Am I wrong to want more from him? Or am I asking for something he's never been capable of giving? When Daniel and I decided to get married, we knew it had to be something small and meaningful. Neither of us had the means for an extravagant celebration, and honestly, we didn't want one. What mattered most was celebrating our love in a way that felt genuine. Once we agreed on a civil ceremony, we started planning every detail together. Living in Europe, we were far from my family in Southeast Asia, but they were still a significant part of the planning process. I made sure to update them on the date and time of the ceremony, even factoring in the time difference so they could participate. The plan was simple. They'd join via video call to witness the ceremony live. While I knew it wouldn't compare to having them physically present, I tried to make it as inclusive as possible. I envisioned holding my phone up as Daniel and I exchanged our vows, their faces smiling back at us through the screen. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I reminded my parents and sister multiple times about the date and time. I even emphasized the importance of their presence, even if it was virtual. They assured me they'd be there, and I trusted them completely. For me, it wasn't just about them watching. It was about feeling their love and support despite the miles between us. Family has always been a cornerstone of my life, and having them witness one of its most important milestones meant everything to me. Looking back now, I wonder if I'd set myself up for disappointment. Had I expected too much from them, particularly from my father? At the time, though, the thought didn't even cross my mind. I believed wholeheartedly that they'd show up for me, just as I'd have done for them. It was my wedding day, after all. A day meant to be filled with love, unity, and family. Or so I thought. A week before my wedding, my sister got engaged. She and her fiancé had planned a short trip with my parents, and during that time, he proposed to her. It was a beautiful moment, something she had dreamed about, and I couldn't have been happier for her. However, this joyful occasion came with its complications. My sister, understandably, wanted to keep the engagement announcement private until she could share it herself. She specifically asked our father not to post anything online until she was ready. It was a reasonable request, one that most people would respect. But my father had other ideas. Barely a day later, he uploaded the photos of her engagement to his social media, ignoring her wishes entirely. She was devastated, not because the engagement wasn't celebrated, but because her personal moment had been taken out of her hands. I remember consoling her over the phone, trying to help her process the situation. That incident lingered in my mind as my wedding approached. It wasn't just about the photos. It was about a larger pattern of disregard. It made me wonder whether my own boundaries would be respected during my wedding. I had one key request, that no one post anything about the ceremony until Daniel and I did. It felt like a simple boundary, one I hoped my family would honor. The engagement fiasco, however, added an undercurrent of anxiety. It wasn't just about my father's actions. It was about how they reflected his priorities. While I didn't think it would affect my wedding day directly, the incident served as a reminder of how challenging it could be to navigate my relationship with him. Little did I know that dynamic would play an even bigger role than I anticipated. The day of the wedding was a whirlwind of emotions. Daniel and I woke up early, eager and slightly nervous. It was a simple civil ceremony, but the significance of the day made everything feel heightened. From getting ready to finalizing last-minute details, the hours seemed to fly by in a blur. Our friend, who was helping with transportation, ended up getting lost on the way to the location. It delayed everything by a bit, but we tried to stay calm and focus on the joy of the occasion. Once we arrived, there was still a lot to do. The minister needed to double-check the information on the paperwork, and we had to make sure all the arrangements were in place. Amid all the chaos, I handed my phone to a close friend to manage the video call with my family. I wanted to ensure they were part of the ceremony, even if only through a screen. At the scheduled time, my sister and mother joined the call, their faces lighting up the screen as they greeted me. The ceremony itself was magical. Standing next to Daniel, exchanging vows, and feeling the weight of our commitment was everything I'd hoped for. I was so wrapped up in the moment that I didn't even realize my father wasn't on the call. It wasn't until later, when I got my phone back, that I noticed his absence. "Where's Dad?" I asked my sister, confused. She hesitated for a moment before giving me a sheepish look and saying, "He fell asleep." I didn't know how to react. On such an important day, the fact that he hadn't even stayed awake felt like a strange mix of hurt and absurdity. But I pushed the thought aside, choosing to focus on the joy of marrying Daniel. It was my wedding day after all. No room for disappointments. At least, that's what I told myself. The days following the wedding were a blur of happiness and reflection. Daniel and I spent time soaking in the joy of being newlyweds, recounting the ceremony, and looking forward to building our life together. The wedding may have been small, but it felt monumental to us. However, as the excitement began to settle, I couldn't shake the lingering thought of my father's absence during the ceremony. At first, I brushed it off as just another quirk of his, but the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. He had known about the wedding for weeks. He'd been given the time and reminded of its importance. How could he have simply fallen asleep? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was tired or distracted. Maybe my mother and sister hadn't wanted to wake him. But no matter how much I tried to justify it, the hurt was there, gnawing at the edges of my happiness. His absence felt symbolic of a deeper disconnect, one that I had tried to ignore for far too long. 1 week after the wedding, I received a message from my father. It was brief and congratulatory, but it lacked any acknowledgement of his absence. Hoping for some clarity, I asked him why he hadn't joined the video call. Instead of answering, he deflected with vague reassurances, saying, "Just know that I'm happy for you." His response felt dismissive, as though the matter wasn't important enough to address. I wanted to move past it, but the more I thought about his lack of accountability, the more it hurt. This was my wedding day, a once-in-a-lifetime event, and he hadn't even bothered to show up. Not physically, not virtually. And now, it seemed, he wasn't willing to take responsibility for that either. In the week that followed the wedding, life slowly began to return to normal. Daniel and I started settling into the rhythm of our married life, balancing work, household responsibilities, and the occasional stolen moment to reminisce about our special day. For the most part, it felt like the beginning of a new and wonderful chapter. But amid the happiness, the unanswered question of my father's absence lingered. I wanted to move on, to let it go and focus on the positives, but his silence about the wedding made that difficult. It wasn't until a week later that he finally reached out to me. His message was short and congratulatory. "Congratulations to you and Daniel. I'm happy for you both." There was no mention of why he hadn't joined the video call, no explanation, no apology. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar mix of disappointment and frustration welling up inside me. Hoping to get some clarity, I responded, "Thank you. But why weren't you on the call? I noticed you weren't there, and it hurt me." I sent the message, hoping for honesty, or at least some acknowledgement of my feelings. What I received instead was a cold deflection. "Just know that I am happy for you," he replied, ignoring my question entirely. It was as though my feelings didn't matter, as though the topic itself was inconvenient for him. Later that day, he sent me another message. This time, a series of photos showcasing their Christmas preparations back home. The images of festive decorations, food, and a smiling family stung in a way I hadn't expected. They felt like a reminder of the emotional distance between us, as if he was living his life completely unaffected by what had transpired. The final blow came when he added, "What about us here?" implying that I should send money for their Christmas celebrations. In that moment, something inside me snapped. My wedding day had been dismissed, my feelings disregarded, and now, instead of support or love, he was making demands. The hurt I'd been trying to suppress came flooding back, impossible to ignore any longer. The message from my father hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What about us here?" he wrote, casually weaving a request for money into our conversation. I stared at the screen in disbelief, the words blurring as my frustration grew. It wasn't the first time he'd asked for financial help. Over the years, I'd done my best to support my family when I could, even though Daniel and I often had to stretch our budget to make ends meet. This time, however, the timing made it sting so much more. A week had passed since my wedding, a day he hadn't even bothered to attend virtually. Instead of explaining his absence or offering any genuine sentiment, he chose to focus on what I could do for him. The priorities were clear. My feelings didn't matter, but my wallet did. What hurt most wasn't the request itself, but the lack of acknowledgement for what had just happened. I'd already given my sister a small grocery budget to help with their Christmas preparations. My father likely didn't know that, but it didn't matter. His message wasn't about asking for support. It was about entitlement. I replied, trying to keep my tone measured. We still need to do some last-minute shopping for our own Christmas meal. It was my subtle way of saying we couldn't help much this time. His response was curt and dismissive, as though my own financial constraints were irrelevant. This was the moment when everything came to a head. The years of emotional manipulation, the lack of effort during my wedding, and now this, asking for money while ignoring the hurt he'd caused. It felt like a breaking point, the culmination of a pattern I could no longer tolerate. I couldn't hold it in any longer. My father's dismissive attitude toward my wedding, coupled with his sudden request for money, had pushed me past my breaking point. For years, I had endured his manipulative tactics and his tendency to prioritize his needs above anyone else's. This time, it felt too personal, too blatant to ignore. I decided to confront him directly. My fingers hovered over my phone's keyboard as I debated how to word my message. Finally, I wrote, "I don't understand how you could miss my wedding and then ask me for money. It really hurts that you didn't even make an effort to be there for me on such an important day." I hit send, my heart racing as I waited for his reply. When it came, it was everything I expected and dreaded. A long, toxic rant filled with guilt-tripping and deflection. "You've changed," he wrote. "You're not the same daughter I raised. Whatever happens, I'm still your father. It's Christmas, and this is how you choose to treat me?" His words felt like daggers, but they were all too familiar. He had used this same rhetoric countless times before, twisting situations to make himself the victim and paint me as ungrateful. He ignored my feelings entirely, focusing instead on his own sense of wounded pride. I replied as calmly as I could, "You made your own choices. I will never understand why you didn't make an effort to join my wedding ceremony." The conversation spiraled from there. He continued to send long, emotionally manipulative messages, each one more toxic than the last. I felt my patience unraveling with every notification. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't keep engaging in this cycle of blame and guilt. It was draining, and it was robbing me of the peace I so desperately needed. Without another word, I blocked his number. For the first time in years, I chose to prioritize my own well-being over maintaining a relationship that only seemed to bring me pain. The decision to block my father wasn't one I made lightly. It felt like a last resort, a line I never thought I'd have to cross. But after years of enduring his emotional manipulation and the recent hurt surrounding my wedding, I realized I couldn't continue this pattern any longer. The moment I hit the block button, I felt an odd mixture of relief and sadness. On one hand, I was finally free from the barrage of toxic messages that always left me feeling drained. On the other, I knew this decision would have repercussions, not just for me, but for the family dynamic as a whole. Blocking him felt like closing a door I had spent my entire life trying to keep open. Growing up, I always tried to see the best in my father, holding on to the rare moments of kindness and hoping they would outweigh the difficult times. But as I reflected on the years of guilt-tripping, emotional outbursts, and neglect, I realized that door had never been truly open. It had always been on his terms. After I blocked him, I braced myself for what might come next. Would he lash out through my mother or sister? Would he try to guilt Daniel into speaking on his behalf? A part of me expected this, but I also felt determined to hold my ground. This wasn't about punishment or cutting ties forever. It was about setting a boundary I desperately needed. My wedding day had been a moment of joy and new beginnings, but his actions, and his refusal to take accountability, had cast a shadow over it. I needed peace, and for the first time, I chose to claim it for myself. Blocking him wasn't just an act of defense. It was an act of self-preservation. Blocking my father didn't put an end to the situation. Far from it. The very next day, he found another way to make his voice heard. My phone may have been silent, but Daniel's wasn't. My father had decided to message my husband instead. At first, I didn't know what he had written. Daniel, ever calm and protective, approached me gently, holding his phone. "Your dad messaged me," he said, showing me the texts. The messages started with what seemed like an attempt to explain himself. I fell asleep, and they didn't wake me up. It wasn't intentional. It felt like a hollow excuse. How could he have slept through an event I had reminded him about so many times? His tone quickly shifted, spiraling into his usual manipulative rhetoric. "When I die," he wrote, "you will cry. You'll regret treating me this way." That single sentence reignited a storm of emotions in me. He had used that same line throughout my life, weaponizing guilt to keep control. It hurt me deeply when I was younger, but now, reading it again, I felt something different: numbness. Daniel, however, didn't let it go unanswered. Calmly but firmly, he replied, "Start loving what you have now, rather than focusing on what you might lose." His words were simple but powerful, cutting through the noise of my father's manipulations. When Daniel showed me his response, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He wasn't just standing up for me, he was setting a boundary of his own. "Let's leave it at that," I told him. "Engaging further will only give him more ammunition." My father didn't reply after that, but I knew this wasn't over. Not entirely. His silence wasn't resolution, it was a pause. Still, in that moment, I felt a small sense of victory. For once, I wasn't alone in facing his toxicity. I had someone by my side who understood and supported me, and that made all the difference. Daniel's support through all of this has been my anchor. While I've always known he's a kind and understanding partner, his actions during this ordeal have shown me just how deeply he cares. He's been my shield, my sounding board, and my reminder that I'm not alone. When my father reached out to Daniel, I could see the initial frustration on his face. He didn't want to be dragged into the conflict, but he also wasn't going to let my father's behavior go unchecked. The way he responded, calm, measured, and firm, was everything I needed but couldn't muster in that moment. His words, "Start loving what you have now," were a stark contrast to my father's manipulations. Where my father relied on guilt and blame, Daniel's response was rooted in truth and kindness. It was a reminder that love should be about presence and effort, not control or coercion. After sending the message, Daniel turned to me and said, "I won't let him hurt you anymore." Those words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I processed everything that had happened. It wasn't just about this one moment. It was about years of feeling unsupported and unprotected in my relationship with my father. With Daniel, I finally felt what it meant to be truly supported. He didn't try to fix everything or tell me what to do. He simply stood beside me, offering his strength when mine felt depleted. This situation with my father has been painful, but it's also clarified what I want in my relationships moving forward. Love should be mutual and respectful, not something that leaves you feeling smaller or weaker. In Daniel, I've found that kind of love, and for that, I'm endlessly grateful. As I reflected on everything that had unfolded, I couldn't ignore the sense of déjà vu. My father's behavior during my wedding wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had played out time and time again throughout my life. Growing up, I saw glimpses of the father I wished he could consistently be. There were moments of warmth, like when he'd bring home small gifts or cheer me on at school events. But those moments were always overshadowed by his unpredictable temper, his sharp words, and his constant need to assert control. One of his favorite tactics was guilt. Whether it was about money, respect, or family loyalty, he always found a way to twist situations so that I felt responsible for his happiness, or lack thereof. If I dared to set a boundary or express a grievance, his response was swift and cutting. Accusations of ingratitude, reminders of his sacrifices, and dramatic predictions about how I'd regret everything when he was gone. As a child, this was devastating. I internalized the belief that I wasn't enough, that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't meet his expectations. It wasn't until I was much older, and after countless conversations with friends and therapists, that I began to see these patterns for what they were: manipulation. Still, recognizing it didn't make it any easier to break free. Even now, as an adult living halfway across the world, I feel the weight of his expectations. His absence during my wedding brought all those feelings rushing back, the sense of being overlooked, unimportant, and secondary to his own priorities. This wasn't just about him missing one event. It was about years of missed opportunities for connection and understanding. And while I've tried to rationalize his behavior, to empathize with whatever struggles he might be facing, I'm beginning to realize that the problem isn't mine to fix. The hardest part isn't letting go of the relationship. It's letting go of the hope that he'll change, that he'll finally see me, not as someone to control, but as a daughter who simply wanted his love and support. Forgiveness is something I've wrestled with for as long as I can remember. Growing up with my father, I often felt like forgiveness was less a choice and more an expectation. Whenever he hurt me, whether with words or actions, there was an unspoken rule that I should let it go, move on, and keep the peace. For years, I obliged. I forgave him when he yelled, when he dismissed my feelings, and when he used guilt to get what he wanted. But the forgiveness I offered was rarely on my own terms. It felt forced, a survival mechanism to avoid further conflict. Now, standing at this crossroads, I find myself questioning what forgiveness really means. Is it an act of letting go, a release of the pain and resentment that ties me to the past? Or does it require reconciliation, a mutual effort to mend the broken pieces of a relationship? With my father, reconciliation seems impossible. His refusal to acknowledge my feelings or take accountability for his actions makes it clear that any repair would be one-sided. Forgiving him, in the traditional sense, would feel like absolving him of responsibility without ever addressing the harm he's caused. But holding on to the pain doesn't feel right either. I don't want my relationship with my father, or the lack of it, to consume me. I want to move forward, to focus on the love and stability I've found with Daniel, and to create a life where my peace isn't dependent on anyone else's approval. Forgiveness, I'm learning, doesn't have to mean forgetting or reconciling. It can simply mean choosing to release the hold someone has over you. Perhaps in time, I'll find a way to forgive my father, not for his sake, but for mine. For now, though, I'm taking it one step at a time. As Christmas approached, the contrast between my father's messages and my reality became sharper. While Daniel and I were making plans for a quiet, intimate celebration, I couldn't shake the lingering weight of my father's words. For him, the holiday seemed to be yet another opportunity to push his narrative. His messages, full of emotional manipulation and demands for financial support, felt like a stark reminder of our fractured relationship. He wasn't asking how I was doing or if I was happy. His focus was on what I could provide for them, as if my value as a daughter was tied solely to what I could give. In the past, I might have felt obligated to respond differently. I would have stretched myself thin, sending money or apologizing for not meeting his expectations, all in the name of keeping the peace. But this year was different. After everything that had happened, I realized that peace wasn't something I could buy with compliance. True peace, I decided, came from within, from protecting my mental and emotional well-being. Daniel and I decorated our small apartment with fairy lights and a modest tree, filling the space with warmth and love. We cooked together, exchanging laughter over burnt cookies and mismatched ornaments. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. It was enough. Still, there was an ache that lingered beneath the surface. Christmas is supposed to be about family, about togetherness and joy. Blocking my father and distancing myself from his toxicity was the right choice, but it also left me mourning the family I wished I had. Sitting by the glow of the tree, I found myself reflecting not just on my father, but on the family I was building with Daniel. This was my chance to create a new kind of tradition, one built on mutual respect and genuine care. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally prioritizing what mattered most: peace, love, and authenticity. In the quiet of that Christmas, I made a promise to myself. Moving forward, I would embrace the family I had chosen and the life I was building. That, I realized, was my greatest gift. Even as I tried to focus on the peace I had found by setting boundaries, the voice of guilt remained persistent. It was subtle at times, whispering doubts into my mind when I least expected it. Other times it was louder, an insistent reminder of the unspoken rules of family. Respect your parents, no matter what. Blocking my father, especially during the holidays, felt like crossing a line that society often tells us shouldn't be crossed. I found myself questioning if I was being too harsh. Should I have tried harder to explain my feelings? Was I wrong for cutting off communication instead of seeking resolution? That guilt had been with me for years, instilled by my father's words and actions. "When I'm gone, you'll regret this," he'd say, planting seeds of doubt and fear that grew with every argument. Even now, those words echoed in my mind, their weight difficult to shake. But as I sat with these thoughts, I began to recognize the difference between guilt and accountability. Guilt was what I felt for breaking the unspoken rules, for going against the narrative my father had always controlled. Accountability, on the other hand, was what I needed to demand from him, and what he had never given. I reminded myself of the reasons behind my decision. Blocking my father wasn't an act of spite or cruelty. It was a step toward self-preservation. It was about protecting my peace, creating space for joy, and finally standing up against years of manipulation. The guilt would likely linger for a while. After all, unlearning patterns and breaking free from toxic dynamics isn't easy. But I was beginning to understand that prioritizing my well-being wasn't selfish. It was necessary. And that realization, however small, felt like a step in the right direction. Amid everything that had unfolded, I couldn't help but think about my sister and mother. They had always been part of the picture, navigating their own relationships with my father while being witnesses to mine. Their roles in this dynamic were complicated, layered with their own histories and struggles. My sister and I have always been close, but even our bond has its limits when it comes to our father. She's seen his manipulative behavior firsthand and experienced it herself, yet she often chooses to avoid conflict rather than confront him. I can't blame her for that. Confrontation with our father rarely leads to resolution. Usually, it just stirs up more tension. During the wedding, my sister had been the one to break the news about my father falling asleep. Her sad smile and apologetic tone spoke volumes. She wasn't just delivering bad news. She was trying to shield me from the hurt she knew it would cause. In her own way, she's always tried to protect me, even when she's caught in the same web of expectations and guilt. My mother, on the other hand, has always been more passive. She rarely challenges my father directly, opting instead to keep the peace. Over the years, I've come to understand that her silence isn't indifference, it's survival. She's learned to navigate his moods and demands in a way that minimizes conflict, even if it means sacrificing her own voice. As I reflected on their roles, I felt a mix of empathy and frustration. I understood why they acted the way they did, but I also wished they could take a stand, not just for me, but for themselves. Their inaction, though unintentional, often made me feel like I was fighting this battle alone. Still, I didn't blame them. We were all trying to cope in our own ways, shaped by years of the same dynamic. If anything, their responses reminded me of why I needed to break this cycle. Not just for my own sake, but to show that change is possible, that we don't have to accept this as our family's legacy. As I sat with the weight of everything that had happened, a deep yearning for change began to take hold. Not just change within my relationship with my father, that I had begun to accept might never come, but change in how I approached the relationships and dynamics that shaped my life. For years, I had carried the hope that my father would one day see things differently, that he would recognize the pain his actions caused and make an effort to mend our bond. But that hope had started to feel like a heavy chain, keeping me tied to an endless cycle of disappointment. Instead of hoping for him to change, I realized I needed to focus on the changes I could make. I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could shape the future. I could choose to surround myself with people who valued and respected me, who saw my worth without conditions or manipulation. This wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about building a foundation for the family Daniel and I were starting together. I didn't want the patterns of my past to seep into my future. I wanted to create a home where love was unconditional and boundaries were respected. A home where I didn't have to choose between being myself and being accepted. The desire for change didn't mean abandoning the idea of reconciliation entirely. If my father ever chose to reflect and take accountability, I would be open to rebuilding our relationship. But until then, I had to focus on what I could control: my own healing, my own boundaries, and my own peace. This was a turning point for me, a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. Change wouldn't come overnight, but the decision to pursue it felt like a step toward reclaiming my life and my happiness. As I sit here reflecting on everything, I find myself questioning my decisions. It's easy to feel confident in the moment, to set boundaries and stand firm, but doubts have a way of creeping in when things quiet down. That's why I'm sharing this story with you, not just to unburden myself, but to hear your perspectives. Let me recap. My father missed my wedding, a day I had hoped would bring us closer despite the distance. He claimed he fell asleep, but his lack of effort to join, even virtually, left me feeling hurt and disregarded. A week later, instead of acknowledging my feelings or addressing his absence, he asked me for money for Christmas. When I confronted him, he deflected, turning the conversation into an attack on my character. He accused me of changing, of being ungrateful, and even resorted to his old guilt-tripping tactics, talking about how I'd regret everything when he was gone. It was the same cycle I had experienced my whole life: manipulation, denial, and a refusal to take accountability. Eventually, I blocked him, not out of anger, but out of a need for peace. I couldn't let his toxicity continue to overshadow my happiness. Yet, even now, I wonder, did I go too far? Should I have tried harder to maintain the connection, even if it meant compromising my own well-being? I can't shake the voice in my head that whispers, "He's your father. You owe him more than this." But do I? What does respect look like when it's one-sided? What does forgiveness mean when the other person refuses to change? I'm sharing this with you because I need to know, was I wrong? Did I overreact by blocking him, especially during the holidays? Or was I justified in prioritizing my mental health and happiness? Your thoughts might help me see this situation more clearly. For now, I'm left with a mix of relief and guilt, peace and sadness, as I try to make sense of a relationship that has shaped so much of who I am. What would you have done in my place? As I bring this story to a close, I'm left reflecting on everything that's happened: the pain, the realizations, and the decisions I've made. This hasn't been an easy journey, and even now, I feel the weight of my choices pressing on me. But one thing is clear: something needed to change. My father's absence at my wedding was more than just a missed moment. It was the culmination of years of neglect, manipulation, and emotional distance. It brought to light the imbalance in our relationship and forced me to confront truths I had long ignored. Blocking him was my way of reclaiming control, not of him, but of my own peace. In the days since, I've had moments of doubt and sadness, questioning whether I made the right decision. I think about the what-ifs, the possibilities of reconciliation and understanding, and I feel a pang of longing for a version of our relationship that might never exist. But I also feel a sense of relief. For the first time in years, I'm not caught in the exhausting cycle of guilt and obligation. I've given myself permission to prioritize my own well-being, to create a life where love is nurturing, not conditional. This experience has taught me the importance of boundaries, not just with my father, but with anyone who refuses to respect my feelings or my worth. It's shown me that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation, and that it's okay to choose peace over connection when the relationship becomes too damaging. As I look to the future, I'm hopeful. I have Daniel by my side, a partner who values and supports me in ways I never thought possible. Together, we're building a foundation of love and respect, one that I hope will be free from the patterns of the past. To those who've taken the time to listen, thank you. Sharing this story has been both cathartic and illuminating. I may not have all the answers, but I know this. I'm ready to move forward, to embrace the love I have, and to let go of the pain that no longer serves me.